It's going to be a kind of self-sharing event, so I am not going to be jumping up and down to introduce every speaker. They will introduce themselves. But we've got a really great and packed programme today. We're going to have a brief welcome from our sponsors. You can see their names here. So we've got Kieran from the ESRC, we've got Chris from the Department for Education. We don't have James from ACAS, but I have a message, so I will be popping up again to read up the message from James. And we've got Greg from the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. Brief welcome from them, and then we'll get into the kind of substance of what we're talking about today. So you can see that and Felstead's going to, what is this survey? What do we use it for? Professor Green is going to talk about workplace abuse. We're going to hear from Professor Gallie on participation at work. We're going to hear from Rhys Davies on my favourite bit of the agenda, obviously, on whether the tide has turned for trade unions. And then we're going to get this really interesting presentation from Professor Zhou on what makes work meaningful. And finally, at the end of all that, we will get the chance to ask some questions. So I'm sure people will have loads of questions as you go through. We are going to save it up to the end to get through the presentations, and so you get to see the whole picture we're presenting today. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. Just a few words from me about why I was so pleased to be invited to speak and chair this event today. I'm really pleased to actually have the opportunity to listen to the presentations. That's the bit I'm most looking forward to. Obviously, the Skills and Employment Survey is a really, really vital tool for everybody who cares about work in the UK. And of course, that's what the trade union movement is here to do. We use it regularly in our work. We've used it to make the case for better employment rights, to make the case for more participation in work, and to make the case actually for the role of trade unions as well. And I think we'll hear more about that today. But I think it's really important that we have this survey and this data in place, not just to make the case for those changes in the world of work, but to actually see whether what we're doing is making any difference. So this is about shaping policy, but I think it should be about monitoring the impact as well. And right now, we've got a whole load of policy change going on in the world of work. We've got that employment rights bill going through Parliament, massive opportunity to improve our individual rights, from banning 0 hours contracts, better sick pay, an end to fire and rehire, but also improving our collective rights. So we've got new rights for trade unions to access workplaces. We've got a rollback on some of those restrictions on the right to strike. So over the next few years, we're really going to need to see, has that actually made the difference we've all said it will in the world of work? Have we managed to use those rights to actually drive up living standards? We've also obviously got big discussions about skills and about industrial strategy, taking on some of those challenges about how technology is going to change the way we work, what impact will artificial intelligence have on jobs. And again, really important that we have this set of high quality data where we can shape what is happening there, inform those decisions by the best quality evidence, but also find out whether the policy change that policymakers are making is actually delivering the improvement in people's working lives, which I hope that everybody in this room wants to see. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to go straight into our first speaker. So I'll sit down and hear it.
So I've just got a few remarks because So yeah, I've just got a few remarks because as a research fund, the most interesting part of what we do is research that we've done. So social and data investments like the Skills and Employment Survey, funded by ESRC and our other partners, are a pillar for UK social science research and for policy as well. Provision of high quality data is really integral to our missions as an organisation, but also the government missions, and maximising public benefit, advancing the UK as a world leader in social science. And the Skills and Employment Survey in particular aligns with the strategic interests of productivity, so improving the economy, and it really enhances what researchers can understand about what working life looks like in the UK today and how that's changing. The study contributes to sustaining a really vibrant and healthy research base in the UK across academia, government, third sector, businesses as well. We're really pleased to be here today with DFE, ACAS, Northern Ireland Executive, as collaboration between people and organisations and our infrastructures as well is key to our delivery plan. The survey's collaboration with trade unions and employers and tech colleagues at Wizard has really created good benefits, including through its helping to build police. The findings reports today have some really important implications for policymakers and employers thinking about how we're organised. And it raises really important questions around the safety of those who work in the UK as well. These findings will no doubt lead to further research, contributing to public discourse and public policy, which hopefully creates a lot of public good. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. I hope that you're quite informative. I hope that you're inspired to go on and use the data for research. Thank you.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name's Rhys Davies. It's a pleasure to be here today at this important event. We get to dive into the findings of this study. So I'm a Principal Research Officer for Technical Education at the Department for Education. Our division, which is Skills Policy Analysis, conducts research across a range of further education programs, including apprenticeship, A-level, soon-to-be technical excellence colleges, technical workforce. So you can see why we have a particular interest in this study. We also manage a number of our own large-scale surveys that help ensure that policy decisions are grounded in robust evidence. So today, I'd just first like to start by congratulating the research team for delivering another high-quality survey. And the Skills and Employment Survey is one of the longest-running studies in the field of skills research. And given the challenges of money, rising costs, and the evolving research landscape, I just commend the team for their commitment to innovation and ensuring continued success of this invaluable study. So the survey has never been more relevant, really. The world of work has changed in a fundamental way since 2017, from hybrid and remote work to an increased focus on productivity and digital skills. Workers and employers face new challenges and opportunities as well. Automation and AI are transforming industries and demanding a workforce that is adaptable and continuously upskilling. And demographic changes too, such as an aging workforce, are reshaping the landscape. And this study offers crucial insights into how these shifts are affecting workers across the UK. So the Skills and Employment Survey is directly aligned with the Department for Education skills agenda, particularly in addressing qualification needs and inequalities. The findings highlight, well, not to give spoilers, but the findings highlight a significant rise in the demand for graduate level qualifications, with nearly half of workers now needing a degree for their roles, which is just up from one in 5 in 1986. And this just emphasised the importance of investment in higher and further education, apprenticeships and technical training to ensure we meet the needs of employers. And encouragingly, the survey also reveals that there's also a decline in overqualification rates, suggesting that more workers are finding roles that align with their skills. So for the Department for Education, the survey also complements our own employee skills survey, which some of you may have heard of. And the last study highlighted ongoing challenges such as declining investment in training, declining employer investment in training, and record high number of skills shortage vacancies as a result of skill shortages. And while the ESS captures the employer perspectives, the Skills and Employment Survey helps us understand how employees experience these changes, particularly in terms of training and career progression and job quality. So together, these two studies provide a powerful and comprehensive view of the skills landscape. Just a plug, later this year we'll be releasing our own latest edition of the employer skill survey. So I look forward to comparing and contrasting the results from the employee side and the employer side later this year. And yeah, by understanding the employer and the employee perspectives, we can help shape policies that bridge that skills gap. So finally, I just wanted to thank everyone involved in this essential work. The dedication is ensuring that we have the evidence we need to navigate the future of work. And yeah, I look forward to today's discussions and how we can use these insights to drive well evidenced and impactful policy.
Right, this is the bit where you pretend I'm James. It's send me something to read out, so I will do that. I'm just going to say we're not clapping the speakers, but we will give everyone a round of applause at the end. So James says, the Skills and Employment Survey is a unique, nationally representative data source that captures employee experiences and work. It offers rich insight into how the world of work is changing, shining a light on a range of topics highly relevant to ACAS. By part of funding it, ACAS demonstrates its commitment to ensuring that its advice and services are informed by the latest evidence. The survey's findings will play an important role in forming ACAS's current and future research and policy profile. In the absence of the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, which might be a plug to restart the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, the value of the Skills and Employment Survey's unique contribution to the social science data resource infrastructure cannot be overstated. ACAS is delighted to have helped deliver. So really warm conversation there from James. Over to you, Graham.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Graham Wilkinson. I'm from the Department of the Economy in Northern Ireland. Just a few brief comments from me. I'd like to thank Alan and the rest of the research team for the work. As you might imagine, being the Director of Skills, and you get to read lots of pieces of research. But I said to Alan, I thought it was an excellent piece of work. It is very thought-provoking, and it just wants you leads on to various questions if you will. I've got lots of questions. No, seriously, it is a really important piece of work, and as Chris has said, the world of work is changing exponentially and so quickly. But these are really important pieces of research that we need from a perspective. And how do we shift and change policy to meet the needs of a changing economy? That is really important. From our department's perspective, we've had a huge amount of change over the last couple of years. We now have an executive in place in Northern Ireland, we have a minister in post, and we have a new economic vision. How things have changed. But in terms of that economic vision, that is focused around productivity, good jobs, decarbonisation and regional balance in our economy. And whenever I read the various bits of research, it really resonated with me. Those are the sorts of challenges that we face. And certainly I think it will help us in our journey. One of the things that we are very passionate about is around good jobs. And again, that was very prevalent in research. And again, just listen to Kate, that's something that is not unique to Northern Ireland. For me, this isn't just about the research, it's about the collaboration. And I think that provides us with a fantastic opportunity. For us as well, we really, in terms of our future economic growth, having people in the labour market is a big challenge for us. And retaining people in the labour market is really important. So our minister is very clear about having good work, having work that people enjoy, keeping people in the workplace is really important. Certainly with the impact of COVID, what we have witnessed is a large number of the over 50s, and I'm in that category myself, are leaving work, are retiring early. And that's something that we need to guard against, that we need to ensure that work is good, something that people enjoy. And also in terms of artificial intelligence, I think that is something that we're very interested in from a government policy point of view. How can AI actually help us to enhance our productivity? Productivity is something that's bedeviled us for decades in Northern Ireland. How do you solve that problem? We look at India over the border, where Ireland have a 40% improvement in terms of productivity. So there's lots of things that we can do, but I'm really keen on the collaboration that we can develop through this piece of research. So I'm really looking forward to the speakers, and I have lots of different
I can't thank at that point. Technology, gosh. Hello, my name's Alan Felstead. I'm based at the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data, WIZARD for short. Puns about Welsh wizards and so forth. Based at Cardiff University, WIZARD with an S on Z. I also lead the Skills and Employment Survey, which we're talking about today. This slide just kind of depicts how the world itself has changed immeasurably over the last 40 years. And if you just scan your eye over the faces, the little pictures there, you'll see how the world has changed so much. Of course, we've all got older. Hasten to add, sorry about that. And the world around us has changed significantly too. So if you look in 1986, we had the opening of the M25. We had Maradona's, he scored a goal with his hand, the hand of God. Scrolling forward in 2006, we had Google acquiring YouTube and the first version of the iPhone. Can you believe it? The first version of the iPhone in 2006. Scrolling forward further in 2017, a fire broke out in Grenfell Tower and Donald Trump, million name, became the 45th US president. Scrolling forward nearer to today, in 2024, the Labour Party was elected to government. Donald Trump again became the US president the second time, and the Olympics were held in Paris. The date points on this slide coincide with the points at which the Skills and Employment Survey was carried out. You'll see sometimes 4, sometimes 7 years apart. We tend to say 6 years on average apart. The timing has often been driven by funding availability. Thank the funders here in front of me for funding the survey this time, but it is often dependent on funding availability. The Skills and Employment Survey, SES as we like to call it, allows us to examine how the world of work has changed over almost 40 years, that 40-year period that this slide depicts. The Skills and Employment Survey 2024 is a survey of workers, that's employees and the self-employed, who are working in Britain, and in some surveys in Northern Ireland as well. 2024 survey was extended to Northern Ireland. It was in 2006 as well, so we thank the Department for Economy for allowing us to do that. It's the 8th in the series, and the series itself consists of interviews with almost 35,000 workers. The detailed data have been collected about the jobs respondents hold. So that includes the skills they use, what their jobs are like, such as how much autonomy they enjoy, whether they are subject to abuse at work, if they feel that their jobs are valuable and meaningless, and whether they are a member of a trade union, and if not, whether they would like to join one. The similar methods have been used at each survey point, and many of the questions have remained the same. We can therefore paint a picture of how the world of work has changed over that time period. The survey series is an important part of our data infrastructure. I'm glad that the funders agree with that statement. With each investment building on previous investments. This isn't a one-off investment, it's an investment that's been going on for 8 times. So this compounds the importance of the data series to the academic and policy making community. Over 230 publications have been produced using the data in the series, and over 1,000 users have downloaded the data, with 120 of those coming from the policy making community. So it does reach beyond the usual suspects. The 2024 data will become available to users by the UK Data Service in 2026. So again, a resource for everybody to use. There is much to explore in this data series and the new survey in 2024, more than we can present at these launch events. We're presenting 8 short reports, 4 today and 4 again on the 19th of May. I'll repeat that date time and time again, just as a plug. But it's a treasure trove of information and data that I urge people to look at. There is a flyer in your packs, if you happen to be here in the room with us today, which profiles 6 papers the research team have produced based on the data series. A fuller list can be seen if you scan this QR code or if you click on the link on this slide. Traditionally, the survey is based on 60-minute interviews face-to-face with workers living in households selected using random probability principles. In 2024, 2,824 such interviews were carried out. The series therefore offers continuity, and that's one of its big selling points. But it also changes over time. For example, we retire, or probably we prefer to use the word pause, some questions at each wave to make room for new questions of topical interest. So in 2024, we introduced new questions on AI, abuse at work, the meaningfulness of work, and working at home. You'll hear about 2 of those 4 new areas today. The other 2 will be covered in our second launch event on the 19th of May. Same place, same time. Okay, put it in your diaries now. But in a break with tradition, we also carried out in 2024 the survey online. A total of 2,645, almost the same number of face-to-face interviews as online, workers took part in this element of the survey. And this included respondents from Northern Ireland. For those interested in finding out more about how the survey was carried out, nuts and bolts and so forth, and what questions were asked of the questionnaire, please consult the NatSen SES 2024 technical report. It is available on the project website, shown at the bottom of this slide. You can find all the details about questions, how we did it, and so on and so forth. The team at NatSen will be producing a mode analysis report, which will outline what difference asking questions face-to-face as opposed to online makes to the answers given. Mode analysis report, mode analysis. And this will be an important marker, an important methodological piece of work going forward, which will clearly inform how we, the research team, conduct the next survey in 2029, maybe. Whether it will be fully online, partly face-to-face. So a very, very important piece of work. This is a multi-institutional project, hence the logo fest. Forgive me for the logo fest here. Lots of logos on this slide to denote that. And you'll be hearing from all the authors of the reports at our 2 launch events today and on the 19th of May. I've said that 3 times. NatSen, of course, also deserves special mention as they were responsible for collecting the data, and Martin Wood, Sarah Butt, and Curtis Jessup led the face-to-face and online data collection teams. And 2 of those, I think, are in the audience today. Yes, I can see somebody waving to them. So thanks very much for your support. And we do miss those fortnightly Friday meetings. We had fortnightly Friday catch-ups. Throughout the fieldwork period, and I somewhat strangely missed those. But it was a very collaborative adventure, and I do in some ways miss that. But sincere thanks also go to the interviewers who pounded the streets on our behalf, asking people to take part in particularly the face-to-face survey, which is challenging, we know, at the best of times, particularly now. They really are the unsung heroes, the interviewers who go out and persuade people to take part in surveys such as this. Of course, we also need to thank the anonymous respondents who took part. Of course, without them, we would have nothing to say at all. So sincere thanks to those anonymous respondents. You've already heard from the 4 funders, and again, another kind of logo fest here, so I won't repeat the funders. You've already heard from them. I'll move on to today. What we're focusing on today are 4 key research questions, and these are the titles of the written reports in your delegate packs and online at the website shown at the bottom of this slide. They're also the titles of each of the 4 presentations which we're going to hear from today. So I'll therefore hand over to the first of those, namely Francis Green, who will present our first set of findings.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming. My name's Francis Green, and just have to introduce ourselves. Can you hear me all right? I'm Professor of Education and Labour Economics at UCL. And I'm extremely pleased to be opening the meat of this survey, as it were, to give you some actual findings in the first report that we're going to mention. I've personally been involved in this survey since the mid-1990s, when I was leading the thing started off when I was at Leicester University. Alan was working with me at the time, but I can't claim to be the originator of the series. That benefit is still to come in the next presentation. So the skills and employment surveys is basically, as I'm sure you've learned from Alan, it's a very rich and evolving survey. And today, what I want to talk about is one particular aspect of employment, namely the social environment, which is one of the key dimensions of job quality, the social environment of the workplace. And I also apologize, I'm going to start on the dark side, negative side work. I think both this talk and perhaps the next one are going to give you some of the bad news. Let me say, it's not all bad news from this survey, but this is a particular topical interest for us all, which we introduced for the first time. Perhaps we should have introduced it before, but we've introduced it for the first time here. All of you will be familiar, sure, with allegations in the press about workplace abuse, such things as the investigation by the BBC, McDonald's, the allegations of Harrods, and countless others seem to crop up every few weeks, if not month or so, with new headline allegations about misbehaviour, various kinds of the workplace. And the evidence is pretty clear from the studies that are now emerging across the world that these effects, these behaviours are pretty devastating in their effects on the health and well-being of employees. There's been studies around showing not only the job dissatisfaction that arises, but estimates of the impacts on sleep deprivation, mental depression, sickness, absence, loss of earnings, headaches, respiratory and gastric complaints, and even thoughts of suicide have all been linked to forms of workplace abuse. So there should be no doubt that even though not only a relatively small number of people get abused in the workplace, this is a very serious phenomenon. Workplace harassment is unlawful if it's connected to protected characteristics such as sex or sexual orientation. And from last October, in particular for sexual harassment, employers in Britain now have a legal obligation to take steps to minimize the risk of sexual harassment. And so perhaps too early days to see what impact. So this report has one main objective, which is to ask the question, how much abuse is there across the British workplaces? Who is it that's suffering the most? It's not an in-depth survey, it's not an in-depth report, rather, trying to analyze the ultimate causes behind it, but it's a first stage asking who actually gets abused in the workplace. Now, previous evidence tells us that in 2014, there were just 1 in 10 workers in England who reported a personal experience of bullying or harassment at work in the past year. About 1 in 10 workers, yeah. And mostly in that survey, it was found to be by colleagues or supervisors. But a proportion, of course, was neither of them, but by clients or members of the public who were doing the abuse in one form or another. In 2016, there was a major report by the TUC about particularly the experiences of abuse by women union members, and showed an alarming prevalence amongst the sample survey in that report. Admittedly, it's not a representative sample of the British workforce, but nonetheless, in that sample of union members, something like a quarter had reported being the victim of sexual harassment at some point in their working lives. That's the difference, by the way. We're not going to be talking about some point in their working lives. We're going to be talking later about in the past 12 months. So the period does count. And then there was an interesting short report by the Northern Ireland Statistics Agency a few years back that's showing 16% reporting bullying or harassment in the workplace in general across Britain, but only 10% in Northern Ireland. So it's kind of good news for Northern Ireland. But there's been nothing recent really across the whole of the United Kingdom, and looking at all different forms of abuse, and certainly no indication. So there is something of a data scarcity, and we need to get an up-to-date picture of what's going on. The last thing I'll say in background is that evidence from the European Working Conditions Survey. We have Agnes here today, who's led that survey for many years. Evidence from that survey tells us that actually in Britain, the levels of workplace abuse are relatively high. They're above they were in 2015 when we last participated in that survey, above the European average. Violence incidents in the workplace were more than 2.5 times what they were across Europe, and bullying was about 50% higher than across Europe. So yeah, we've got something to think about here. So moving on, here's the question that we asked. Over the past 12 months during the course of your work, have you been subject to any of the following? And you could give yes or no to all of those 4 forms of abuse. Simple question, stolen from the European Working Conditions. And I'll go straight to the main results shown on this graph here. The headline is that across the United Kingdom in 2014, there were overall something like 14%, just 14.3% reporting one or other of either physical violence, sexual harassment, or bullying, harassment. That's 1 in 7 reported bullying. That's the aggregate total figure. Breaking it down by the form of abuse, violence in the workplace, 7%, sexual harassment, 2.4%, bullying, 9%. Say one or other of those, it's 14%. And a third thing to take from this overall slide is a very clear difference there between the experiences of men and women. And we find that overall, the experiences of abuse for women, 19% reporting one or other form of abuse versus 10% for men. Very dramatic difference there. And indeed, in all of the different forms of abuse separately, you can see from the diagram that women are reporting greater levels of abuse than men. Moving on then, the top part of that slide just repeats in essence, giving you the numbers for men and women, but it's perhaps more interesting to move on to the next part of it, which is about people's sexual orientation. And we again find quite a dramatic difference between people with a heterosexual orientation and LGBTQ plus people. And again, in all forms, but if you look at the overall figure at the bottom here, 21% versus about 14%. So quite a dramatic difference in experience according to one's sexual orientation. This next slide takes a look at ethnic groups, differences among ethnic groups. Now, we obviously are limited in the amount of disaggregation one can do because it's not worth looking at cell sizes which are too small. But linking together all Asian ethnic groups, we find quite interesting finding that they, in all forms, reporting lower levels of abuse than on average across the population. Just to summarise it, in the big figure here, 9.9% against the against the overall figure, which is about 14%. Second thing, though, for that diagram is amongst the Black African and Black Caribbean community, we find that the bullying is more likely, but sexual harassment less likely than elsewhere. Not quite sure what to make of that yet, but those are the figures that come out immediately, and it may be explained potentially by what's to come in looking at the different jobs that ethnic groups do. Next category, nation. Does that make any difference? Short answer is not a great deal. Abuse is widespread across our country, the United Kingdom, with the one exception that it seems like there's much lower sexual harassment reported in Northern Ireland, only 0.4% than in the rest of the country. One thing should be said perhaps before I pass on, which is these are perceptions reported, obviously. These are individuals reporting their own experiences, personal report. And you'll understand that interpretations of what exactly is bullying, what exactly is sexual harassment, even though in a way it's an objective concept, can be interpreted with a wide margin of error sometimes. So we have to take all these comparative figures, especially when you're comparing parts of our country with different cultures, with some degree of these skepticism needs backing up by further work. Okay, so it's one thing to say which groups suffer more or suffer less from workplace abuse. But it's also particularly interesting to look at the kinds of jobs that people do and see whether that varies. And we would expect that to happen because, after all, we know that workplace abuse likely to be a consequence of the unequal distribution of power which you see in the workplace. And the fact that in some workplaces there's much more opportunity for abuse than others. There's much more, you've got the freedom to do it if you are of that mind, and particularly if your job is being poorly managed and not being properly supervised. So we would expect job characteristics to matter. So the first thing I'll draw your attention to in this table is the first panel, which looks at the different tasks that people are doing. And we find that jobs where the tasks involved are counselling, advising, or caring tasks considered generically, where they're very important or essential, they are high levels, they carry a high risk of abuse, 18%, much higher than the 40% normal, and all the others only 10%. First idea that actually what you do matters. The second idea from the bottom panel concerns night working, and we find that night working is much more risky and other kinds of working. Perhaps that's not surprising. Moving on to right. Moving on to the sector and whether you're working from home or not. Two things to take from this slide here is that working at home here, the 8% is much lower than the average. The forms of abuse are much lower at working at home. Now, should that surprise us? Perhaps not. But we shouldn't be desperately reassured by that, because we know, for example, that during the COVID pandemic lockdown, when there was a lot more working at home than ever before, that levels of domestic abuse were on the rise, alarmingly. That's from other sources. So it could be that there's some kind of substitution of abuse going on here, taking place more in the home and less actually in the workplace. We don't know the answer to that. The second takeaway from this table here is a very big difference between the private sector and the public sector. So we have something like 20% suffering any form of abuse in the public sector, 1 in 5, compared with the private sector. So, and in particular, yes, let me just draw your attention to this 12% versus 4% in terms of experience of violence. Look at that. This is I'll find the final number slide, which is by occupation. And I'd like to draw your attention first to this figure here, nearly 30% in the caring, leisure, and other service occupations. So that's reflecting in part those task differences we saw before, those three caring tasks and so on. And not only that, if you look at some more specific occupations where we have enough observations, and there are 2 of them, nurses and teachers, we find that 39% of the nurses in our sample, and there are more than 100, because my criterion was I don't look at cell sizes less than 100. There were 39% of nurses reporting some form of abuse or other. And amongst teachers, the next largest group, it was 31% reporting some forms of abuse. So those are the kind of groups which are behind that big public sector number. And it's a really stunning, awfully high figure, I'm afraid. Let me move on then, because this time is short, to draw some implications from this. First of all, abuse isn't rare. It's a minority thing for some people, different forms of abuse, but some form of abuse is not all that rare, 14%, and it's widespread for some groups that I've just isolated. The trends, we don't really know. The figures are higher than previous surveys, but we can't say that they've increased because they're not exactly the same question. But it seems to be very unlikely that it would decrease. These things matter not just for the employees and the workers concerned, because it affects how they contribute to the productivity of the organizations they work for. And indeed, within our own survey, we know that those people who have been abused are more likely, substantially more likely to quit their job, and something like 2.5 times as likely to actually leave the workforce altogether. So from the point of view of the government, which we know is very, very concerned about the large numbers of people, long-term sickness, and not involved in the workforce, this seems to be a potentially contributory factor. So there are some major implications, I think, for what policymakers should think about. I believe that we ought to do a lot more to monitor what's happening in our workforce. I think that we've ignored workplace abuse too long, and that it's very possible at a relatively low expense to monitor the extent and the different forms of abuse going on in the workplace through the labour force survey. I know the labour force survey's had its own troubles, but those troubles are being addressed. And it's relatively low cost to ask a few additional questions about these forms of workplace abuse. And it seems to me, even though it may affect only a small number of people, at least a minority of people, these things have major effects. We now have laws, and we want to know whether they're making any difference. Are the trends moving in a favourable downward direction or not? We can't possibly say that. So it seems to me a no-brainer that we should be asking these questions in nationally representative surveys regularly. It doesn't need to be every year, but at least on a fairly regular basis. That's the biggest single implication I would like to draw. There are, of course, more direct policy implications, in particular for those large groups, the nurses and teachers. We should think, I think, looking at that 39% figures, whether we need to do more to construct a safer workplace for these groups which are suffering major forms of abuse, major risk of abuse. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Right. Yes. I'm Duncan Gallie. I'm an emeritus fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, and my theme is what is happening? Participation. Now, this is a very important issue for two primary reasons. First, we know that it's crucial for well-being. There's now very good longitudinal evidence which shows a strong link between the level of controls employees have at work and the risk of depression. And a meta-analysis has suggested that it can double the risk of major depressive disorder. This is longitudinal data. The second, and perhaps even more serious, is that we know now from longitudinal research that it increases mortality risks. That again, a meta-analysis which covers a wide range of studies and takes the overview of 32 studies suggests that it increases all-cause mortality by about 20% and cardiac disease mortality by 50%. So we're talking about something very serious from the point of view of well-being. But in the recent decades, there's also been a second argument which has been developed about the importance of participation, which is from a strand of managerial theory, which argues that it's crucial for employee motivation and for good job performance. And this is based upon evidence which is emerging about the fact that more participative organizations are associated with higher levels of on-the-job and formal learning. On-the-job learning because people can use trial and error to get better solutions. Formal learning perhaps because they can make a stronger case to management that this is very important for both their well-being and for the performance of the organization. The second part of the sort of evidence base for this comes from studies of innovation, which suggest that more participative organizations encourage workers to contribute more to the innovatory processes, perhaps because they feel more secure in periods of organizational change. And finally, a number of studies have shown a link between new technologies and higher levels of participation. And I think the argument here is quite simple, that when new technologies are introduced, management is faced by a set of less predictable problems. They don't know what is going to go wrong, and they're requiring employees, in a sense, to use their initiative to sort out the problem. And it becomes more important to sort out the problem because new technologies tend to increase the pace of the work process, so that downtime becomes much more costly. Because you've got a set of interlinked arguments. Now, in practice, there are different forms of participation, and we can focus on three. Individual task discretion, that's where the individual controls on their own details about how they do their tasks. And this is perhaps been the most common in the sociological and health literatures. The second is semi-autonomous teamwork, where employees work together well as members of a team to control the work task and take decisions about the work task. And that's been particularly important in the managerial relationship. And the third is a very different sort of participation, which is through organizational voice, where employees can influence wider decisions in the organization that are likely to affect their work. So I'll consider all three of these. They're not at all mutually incompatible. Now, CIS is important for two reasons. The first is that it gives us a representative picture of the workforce. A lot of early work on participation is based on case studies. And of course, case studies can be highly selective. But this gives us a representative picture. And the second important point about CIS data is it gives us the chance to look at data across time, because the same questions have been asked in a consistent way across a long time period. Now, with respect to task discretion, the key question is this: how much influence do you personally have over how hard you work, what tasks you do, how you do the tasks, and the quality standards to which you work? Those four items compose the task discretion index. For autonomous teamwork, we simply change the word you personally to your work group. So how much influence does your work group have over these same items? Turning to organizational participation, we start by looking at the channels of organizational participation. At your workplace, does management hold meetings in which you can express your views about what is happening in the organization? We also ask about quality circles as a potential alternative channel. But the key question that we use for organizational participation is the following one, because this will tell us whether the communication is largely designed to be downward or really to involve employees in a way which gives them some influence over decision making. The question is, suppose there will be some decision made at your place of work that change the way you do your job. Do you think that you personally would have any say in the decision about the change or not? And we've got a scale going from a great deal to none. So what are the trends? To look first at task discretion and semi-autonomous teamwork, which are concerned primarily with control of the work task. If you take the blue line, this is the trend with respect to task discretion. And I think you will agree, this is really very striking. If we're looking at those with substantial task discretion, we've seen a very marked downward trend across the period as a whole, 62% in 1992, going down to 34% in the last survey, 2024. There are two major periods of decline in the 90s and in the period since 2012, and certainly continuing sharply over the period, the most recent period, 2017 to 2024. So a very marked decline in individual task discretion. Now, could it be that what employers have been doing is essentially reducing individual task discretion, but increasing people's control in terms of teamwork, so that people are working as a team? Now, we've seen it from the red line that teamwork has increased very substantially, and particularly since 2001. But if you then turn to the green line, which asks people how much influence they have, you get a very different picture. First of all, only about a third of people who work in teams think that those teams have any real control over the work task. That's been very consistent across time. If you look at the most recent period, 2017 to 2024, what we see is a decrease in semi-autonomous teamwork. So on both measures of influence over the task, whether it's individual or for the team, what we're seeing is declining employee influence over their work tasks. Now, organizational participation. We're looking first at the channels. We see that there's been a rise in the proportion of employees who are in organizations that have consultative meetings. That's the blue line at the top, which rises from 63% to 74% in 1992 to 74% in 2024. The quality circles is much less clear. There was a sharp rise between 92 and 2006, but after that it's been stable. So there's been no evidence for a big increase in this form of involvement of employees in wider decisions. If we look at the key question that we ask about organizational participation, whether or not the employees feel they have some influence over wider organizational decisions, what we see again is evidence of a decline. The figures for 2006, 2012 onwards are all lower than the figures of the 1990s. And if we look at the most recent part of the trend from 2017 to 2024, we see again a decline. So whichever form of participation you take, individual, semi-autonomous teamwork, organizational participation, the picture is one of declining employee participation. Now, which groups have been most affected by this? One of the most common theorems in participation studies is that participation is a function of skill. The more skilled the workforce, the more they're likely to be given opportunities for participation, because employers need those skills and they can make a bigger contribution to the organization, and employers want to retain them in the organization. And we divided the workforce into three broad categories. The higher skilled, which are managers, professionals, associate professionals, the intermediate, which are administrative workers, skilled manual and personal service workers, and the lower skilled, which are sales operatives in elementary work. And you can see that broadly the skill thesis works. There's a very clear skill gradient in terms of both high task discretion and organizational participation. The green column represents the higher skill, and is actually much higher than the blue, which represents intermediate, and the red, which represents lower. But what about change over time in recent periods? They're really taking the burden of this declining participation that we've seen in the more recent period. And I think this is rather interesting. In the past, the higher skills have been very protected from any decline, and the burden has been taken primarily by those with lower skills. If you look at the high task discretion figures, between 2017 and 2024, the lower skills certainly lost discretion. But look at the pattern for the higher skills. They've come down too. And this is a real change from our previous evidence. As a turn to organizational participation, it is really only the higher skills who really seem to have come down. In the case of task discretion, the parts of the higher skilled which were most strongly affected were the associate professionals. In terms of organizational participation, managers, professionals, and associate professionals all saw a significant. We're talking about quite a wide process. There are also interesting changes by gender. M stands for male employees, F for female, and PTF for part-time female. If we look at high task discretion, what we see that in 2017, female employees had higher levels of task discretion than male. They had more control over their jobs than men. But by 2024, that pattern had reversed, because it was women who lost task discretion in a most striking way. I think that's normally we've seen a very similar pattern between men and women over time, but here there seems to be a real differentiation by gender. Of course, part of that was a very substantial decline among part-timers, but that's not the full story, because if you look at female people who are working full-time, they saw an even sharper drop by 5 percentage points. Turning to organizational participation, well, there we see that the overall pattern was somewhat different in that in both years, men were more likely to be able to influence wider organizational decisions than women. But here, men seem to have lost most in terms of the change over the period. So in fact, there's been a reduction of gender differentials with respect to organizational participation. Now, why is the decline? I mean, could it be that the benefits of participation for well-being, motivation, and performance have gone? So it's no longer in the interest of employers to give their employees any substantial say. Now we've taken as measures of well-being 4 items. 2 are drawn from psychologists. They're the enthusiasm depression scale and the contentment anxiety scale that Peter Ward developed in Sheffield. The third is a job satisfaction measure, which is commonly used by economists. And the final one is a sort of value congruence measure. Is my values in the organizations are very similar? How much you agree or disagree with that? And I think the easiest way to read this is to look at the red columns, because these give the percentage points difference between those who have got substantial participation and others. And what you can see is an overall pattern here. This is a very positive one. In almost all cases, participation is having a positive, making a positive difference, as a strong positive association with people's level of well-being. To ask this question, it's very clear. Semi-autonomous teamwork is less of an effect and a negative effect with respect to one item. But what is most interesting is the strength of the effect of organizational participation. You see that in all of these cases, it is organizational participation that makes the biggest. And that surprised me, actually. In a sense, organizational participation has been less discussed in the research literature at the time. But it actually appears to be the strongest factor. Look at this, 25 percentage points difference with respect to enthusiasm and depression, or in terms of value congruence, 20%. In terms of job satisfaction, 31%. What about participation and motivation? Well, here again, we have 4 items. Willingness to work harder, the organisation to succeed. Whether or not people think that the organisation inspires their very best job performance. Whether the job requires learning new things, which is one of the key arguments for why it was likely to be beneficial to performance. And whether or not the employee themselves have made suggestions to improve efficiency, and it has to be more than once for them to score. Now, again, if you look at the columns in red, which give the percentage points difference, you can see that the general picture is very positive for the association between participation and people's motivation and job performance. And again, one of the interesting things is how strong the effect of organizational participation is with respect to at least 3 of these items. For instance, it's the strongest component of the associated with willingness to work harder. It's the strongest with respect to the inspiration of best job performance, and is by far the strongest with respect to the willingness to make decisions, or having actually made decisions, suggestions about how to improve work processes. So organizational participation comes out of these initial analyses as a particularly important form of participation. So the summary implications, well, the cumulative research is now very persuasive. As employee participation, whether in the form of task discretion or organizational voice, is beneficial. And it's beneficial both for employee well-being and employee motivation and job performance. But if we look at the trends, over the decades, British employers have adopted organizational strategies that have reduced both types of participation. And this seems very paradoxical, because we all know that Britain has been experiencing deep problems about productivity growth. We all know that there have been rising problems about work stress in the workforce over the last decade. So I think this raises the question of why has this been happening? Why has the employers been adopting strategies that appear to be throwing away some of the levers that would have been most useful to them? And the second question is, what is to be done? And I look forward to hearing your views on it.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rhys Davies. I'm based at Wizard at Cardiff University. I'm Alan's colleague, and it's been my great privilege to join the Skills and Employment Survey Research Team for the 2024 iteration of the SCS. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the report on trade union membership, the new data that we've got on trade unions from the SES. Has the tide turned for trade unions? Why is this an important topic? Well, as Duncan has just alluded to, organisational participation, employee voice are very, very important aspects of job quality, and trade unions play a key role in supporting organisational participation of employees and supporting employee voice. So I need to investigate what new evidence we have on these issues. So the importance, well, empirical evidence now suggests that trade union membership is associated with a variety of benefits to employees. For example, employees who are trade union members experience a premium in pay of approximately 5%, but they also have greater access to policies, flexible working practices. Trade unions can also improve productivity in the workplace by enhancing participation in skills development and training, for example. They also reduce labour turnover. So there's lots of benefits to trade union membership for both the individuals and the employers. But of course, trade union membership has been in decline over the last 40, 50 years. It reached a peak in the UK in 1979 of 13 million. Most recent estimates suggest that that figure is now just over 6 million. So trade union membership has declined by about half since its 1979 peak. However, trade union membership rates, or union density rates as we call them, have actually remained relatively stable since about 2017. So the downward trend in the rates of union membership seems to have levelled off in recent years. The election of the Labour government has also signalled a change towards the climate towards its unions in the UK. As Kate mentioned earlier on, we've got the Employment Rights Bill going through Parliament at the moment, which seeks to give more freedom and flexibility to unions to organise, negotiate and represent their members by removing the restrictions that were put in place in the 2016 Trade Unions Act and the 2023 Strike Act. Also, trade unions feature very highly in the government white paper on getting people back into work. They're seen as an instrument that provides more secure, stable employment, so they want to get people into work to alleviate poverty and so forth, and want to make sure that people stay in those jobs. So trade unions have an important role in that respect. So we're going to present new evidence based on the SES of the prevalence of trade unions in the UK today, their perceived influence, and also attitudes of workers towards trade union membership. So, indicators of union prevalence and influence. What does the SES contain? Well, so for the backstory to this, official government statistics on trade union membership and trade union prevalence have been beset with difficulties, shall we say, over the last 30 years. The main source of data is the Labour Force Survey. A question on trade union membership was introduced in the LFS in 1992. But we're also interested in not just who are members of trade unions, but who works in workplaces where trade unions are present. We're also interested in who works in workplaces where those workplaces are covered by trade unions for purposes of negotiations of pay and conditions. That's the trade union coverage. So questions on presence and coverage were introduced in the LFS in 93 and 96. However, they were completely changed in 1999, so you don't have a consistent series of data for trade union presence and coverage based upon Labour Force Survey. Also, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who was responsible for producing the statistics a few years ago, had to revise their trade union presence estimates back in 2018 because they were making a mistake in their data. So that led to a 2 million increase in the proportion in the number of employees who were present, who were based at workplaces that were where trade unions were present. There's also been a long-held belief that the trade union coverage estimates from the Labour Force Survey are simply too low, and that's due to the very badly worded question on trade union coverage that was introduced in the late 1990s. And so recently, we've actually seen government official statistics for trade union coverage now moving to the annual survey for hours and earnings and away from the Labour Force Survey, recognising the problems that were associated with the badly worded question included in the LFS. So what do we have in the SES? Well, we have consistent, well-worded questions about trade union membership. We ask respondents, are you a member of a trade union or staff association? At your place of work, are there unions or staff associations, are they present? And then is any union or staff association recognised by management for negotiating pay and or conditions of employment? So those questions have been included in the SES series over many years, so we get a consistent time series of data on those issues. Of course, we're also interested in the impact of trade unions in the workplace. So there's a question in the SES which asks respondents how much influence do they perceive trade unions have in their establishment over the way in which work is organised. And also we have introduced in 2024 new questions about attitudes towards trade unions, where we asked people in workplaces where trade unions weren't present, if they had the opportunity to vote, would they vote for a union to be established, yes or no? And we also asked those people who are employed in the workplaces where trade unions are present, if there was a vote to keep the union or to get rid of it, would they vote yes or no? So we got new data on those issues in 2024. So what do we see? Trends in trade union prevalence. Well, let's start with the union membership first, which is we call that union density, which is the green line on the bottom of this chart. And we can see, yes, there has been a downward trend in union membership from 1986 to 2017, going from 45% down to approximately 25%. But that trend has levelled off in recent years. So trade union membership has remained relatively stable since 2017. So there seems to be that downward trend has halted. We see encouraging signs in relation to trade union presence and trade union coverage. Figures for trade union presence have gone from 48% in 2017 to 52% in 2024. Likewise, trade union coverage, so that's the involvement of trade unions in negotiations over pay and working conditions, that's gone up from 42% to 48%. I should say that these figures are actually mirrored in the labour force survey, but for example, the trade union coverage figures in the labour force survey in 2017 were down at 26%, and they have recovered in 2024 to 30%. But you see the big difference there in the rates of trade union coverage derived from the skills and employment survey compared to those that were previously, the official statistics that were previously based upon the labour force survey. There has been a growth in public sector employment since the pandemic. Of course, we get out 500,000 more public sector workers, and that is contributing in part to that increase. But even when we look at these trends within the public sector and within the private sector, we still get increases in the rates of trade union presence and the rates of trade union coverage. What else have we got in the SES? So, like I said, rates of membership, coverage, and presence, they're good potential. You know, the potential importance of trade unions, but they don't actually tell us anything about, well, do trade unions make a difference? Do they have an impact? So we have questions on trade union influence in the SES, and this is responses to questions to how much influence do trade unions have over the organisation of work in your workplace, and these are the proportion of people who say a lot, or a great deal, or a fair amount. And we see, well, first of all, there's an upward trend in perceived levels of trade union influence since 2012 across all workers. Obviously, trade union members are going to have higher perceived levels of higher perceptions of trade unions having influence over the organisation of work. If you want to join a trade union, or you believe in joining a trade union, you're going to uphold those views compared to non-members who are more likely to perhaps be ambivalent or maybe have negative views towards trade unions. But among both groups there, we see that the perceived influence of trade unions on the organisation of work has been increasing in recent years. What's driving this, though? And we do see that this increase in the perceived influence of trade unions on the organisation of work is being driven by both members and non-members in the public sector rather than the private sector. So amongst employees in the public sector, whether it be non-members or members, there's been a significant increase in the proportion of employees who are saying that unions have an influence over the organisation of work. And a trend that we do not see in the private sector, either amongst members and indeed amongst non-members. We actually see the perceived influence of trade unions declining between 2017 and 2024. So maybe there's something, obviously the timing of the skills employment survey did come off the back of a period of heightened strike activity amongst public sector workers in 2023. So maybe that has something to do with the response that we're seeing here. We can't be sure. Right, attitudes towards trade unions. So like I said, we have questions now about if votes were held in workplaces whether employees would vote to establish or keep trade unions. So let's look at the right-hand side of this chart first. And this is the response to the question, if a vote on the union were held today, would you vote to keep it? So this is in unionised workplaces. If a vote on the union were held today, would you vote to keep it? And as you can see there, 3/4 of workers in unionised workplaces would vote to retain the trade union. About 1 in 5 were undecided and 1 in 20 would say no. Just interestingly, within unionised workplaces, only 50% of people are actually trade union members. So many people who are not trade union members in unionised workplaces, if they were given the opportunity to vote on whether the union should remain or not, they would say, I would like to keep the union. At least 1/4 of workers in unionised workplaces are saying that. Let's switch across now to non-unionised workplaces, where we ask those respondents, if a vote to establish a union was held today, would you vote yes or no? And the responses of this question are fairly easy to remember, broadly speaking. About 1/3 of workers in non-unionised workplaces would say, yes, I would vote to establish a union, 36%. Another 1/3 are undecided, and another 1/3 would say no. But there's certainly there is evidence of a representation gap amongst employees in non-unionised workplaces. There are a significant group of employees who, if they were given the opportunity to vote to establish a trade union, would choose to do so. So we can also take a look at the SES and see how that representation gap, that 36%, varies across different groups of respondents to our survey. And that's what we do in this next chart, the unmet demand for unionisation. Well, there's a strong age component to this unmet demand, where we see that younger workers are more likely than older workers to say that they would vote to establish a trade union. There are probably different effects going on there. For example, younger workers are entering the labour market, they're more likely to enter unorganised sectors of the economy. They may not be in their career job at this stage, they're trying to making their way into the labour market. So over time, they'll have great opportunity to sort themselves into the sectors and into the organisations that meet their preferences for trade union membership. That certainly would be at play. As Francis mentioned earlier on, an important development in the SES for 2024 was the inclusion for the first time of questions on gender identity and sexual orientation. And we see here that people from the LGBTQ+ community who are in non-unionised workplaces are far more likely to say that they would vote yes to establish a trade union. 60% of that group say that they would vote yes to establish a trade union, compared to the 34% of our respondents who record themselves as being heterosexual. So clearly there's my evidence of potentially a group who have been subject maybe or perceive themselves to be at greater risk of victimization or discrimination, seeing the potential benefits of having a trade union at their workplace. We also see a strong relationship in terms of the representation gap with respect to people with ill health conditions. So not only are those people who have ill health conditions more likely to say that they would vote yes in a vote to establish a trade union at their workplace, but it actually increases with the severity of the ill health condition. So, for example, those with no ill health condition, about 1/3 of those people would say, yeah, I'd vote yes to establish a trade union. But amongst those with an ill health condition and who are limited a lot in their activities by that ill health condition, that figure increases to 51%. Finally, we look at geographical variance across the UK, and we see, as we would expect to, that those regions where there has been a historical tradition of trade union membership, particularly the devolved nations and the regions of Northern England, also the Midlands, people living in those areas who are working at non-unionised establishments are more likely to say that they would vote yes to establish a trade union, compared to employees who are based in Southern England, where of course rates of trade union membership have traditionally been much lower. So just to summarise here, what's the analysis though? It paints a picture of relative stability in union membership in recent years. We confirm the analysis of official statistics produced by the Labour Force Survey, but we also see evidence of increasing levels of trade union presence and trade union coverage, and also an increase in perceived influence of trade unions at the workplace. The Skills Employment Survey makes a very important contribution in this space in that it provides a consistent and comparable view of trade union membership, particularly trade union coverage and trade union presence over a long period of time. So it's very important, the data set in that respect. There are, however, remain high levels of unmet demand for unionisation, particularly among those groups where we might perceive them to be more vulnerable to victimisation and discrimination and marginalisation at the workplace. And these groups are certainly more likely to benefit from initiatives included in the Employment Rights Bill to provide trade unions with greater freedom to represent and negotiate on behalf of their members. Thank you very much.
I'm Ying, I'm a professor of human resource management from the University of Surrey. Today I'm going to talk about meaningful work. The pursuit of meaningful work is nothing new. As human beings, we want to feel that what we do matters. However, anthropologist David Weber argued a lot of people work in bullshit jobs that add no value to society. So this bullshit job discourse has prompted public discussion on the meaning of work. In this study, we are going to look at how people perceive the meaning of their work and how these perceptions differ across different labor market groups. Finally, we are going to look at what kind of jobs are most likely to provide a sense of meaning. The concept of meaningful work has fascinated researchers for many decades. Back in the 19th century, Marx proposed the idea of alienation to describe how extreme division of labor and restricted working conditions can lead to a sense of meaninglessness. Taking, for example, factory workers working on assembly lines, he noticed that when work is broken down into very simple and elementary tasks that hardly require any skill, people lost control over their work and have little scope to develop their abilities. Work just became so tedious and boring. It's difficult to derive any pleasure or sense of meaning from such work. More recent research in psychology suggests meaningful work is a critical source of improved well-being. Broadly speaking, there are two types of well-being: hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. Hedonic well-being is mainly concerned with positive emotions or feeling happy. For example, if you smile a lot and rarely feel angry or sad, then you have high level of hedonic well-being. The eudaimonic well-being is quite different. It's about a sense of meaning and purpose, or the feeling that you are doing something that's worthwhile, significant, and useful. Most research so far on well-being has focused on hedonic well-being, but there's growing recognition of the importance of eudaimonic well-being. Happiness is important, but we also need a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. Some researchers even argue this is a deeper and more enduring source of well-being. Meaningful work is not only good for individuals, it also benefits organizations. In business management research, a growing body of empirical evidence suggests when people find their work meaningful, they are more motivated, they perform better, and they are less likely to quit their jobs. So when people find their work meaningful, they are more likely to go the extra mile. Many companies are starting to see meaningful work as a way of increasing performance and competitive advantage. So in short, the promotion of meaningful work benefits both individuals and organizations. As such, it lies at the interface of labor market policies to promote economic growth and social rights. There are two main perspectives on the meaningfulness of work. The first one is called the self-realization perspective. This is quite closely aligned with Marx's concept of alienation. It emphasizes the importance of work for satisfying fundamental human needs. So for work to be considered meaningful, it must allow individuals to exercise control and develop their skills and abilities. Enriched work, which satisfies these fundamental human needs, are more meaningful than tedious and repetitive work imposed by other people. In contrast to the self-realization perspective, the social justification perspective emphasizes the objective value of work. So from this standpoint, meaningful work must produce outcomes that make a positive contribution to society. So the key distinction between the two perspectives hinges on whether meaningfulness comes from personal fulfillment or from making a positive contribution to society. Work can be meaningful in one sense, but not the other. For example, developing addictive mobile phone games for young children may require high levels of skill and autonomy. Although it might provide a sense of personal satisfaction, few people would consider such work meaningful due to its harmful consequences. On the other hand, work can be meaningful even when it is not particularly enjoyable. For example, care workers who look after patients with terminal illnesses often feel a strong sense of meaning, despite the work being repetitive, exhausting, and often poorly compensated. So the distinction between the two perspectives of meaningful work is well established, but most research evidence so far has focused on the self-realization perspective, probably because of its longer theoretical tradition and data availability. We have much less evidence on meaningful work from the social justification perspective, particularly evidence based on large representative data sets. To inform policies on meaningful work, we need a comprehensive assessment of how people perceive the meaning of the work that incorporates both perspectives. This study is based on the latest wave of the UK Skills Employment Survey, which introduced measures of meaningful work for the first time. We use both face-to-face and online components of the survey, which includes a sample of 5,464 respondents. The samples are drawn from both Britain and Northern Ireland, so it covers the entire UK labour market. We have three indicators of meaningful work. People will ask how frequently they experience these feelings. Your job gives you the feeling of a job well done. You have a feeling of doing useful work. Your job gives you a sense of belonging. Although these items are highly correlated, it captures slightly different facets of meaningfulness. The first statement addresses personal achievement, reflecting meaningfulness from the self-realization perspective. The second item is focused on the broader value of work, reflecting social justification perspective. And third one focuses on social connections at work, which is a recognized source of well-being, motivation, and meaning. The answers to these questions range from never to always. We are going to present separate stats for each item first, and later on we are going to introduce a summative index that incorporates three items. So this figure shows percent meaningful work across UK. As you can see, most workers in the UK find their work meaningful. About 50% of respondents said they had a feeling of a job well done most of the time, and a further 18% said this is always the case. If we look at the people who said they have a feeling of doing useful work, again, about 3/4 of respondents said they had such feelings either always or most of the time. If you look at the opposite end scale, the proportion reporting low meaningfulness is quite low. Only 1% of UK workers said they never had a feeling of a job well done or the feeling of doing useful work, and 3% said they never had a sense of belonging. If we add never and rarely together as a proxy of meaningless work or the so-called bullshit jobs, the percentage is quite small across the board. So our findings are consistent with research based on European Working Conditions Survey, which also found meaningless work is actually quite rare. David Graeber argued about 30 to 60% of people have bullshit jobs, and our evidence does not support that argument. In reality, most people in the UK find their work motivating, useful, and socially rewarding. There are notable variations in perceptions of meaningful work by gender and age. Here we are taking the percentage reporting always finding their work meaningful as a stronger indicator of meaningful work. You can see female employees report a higher level of meaningfulness than male employees across the board. If we take useful work, for example, about 28% of male employees always had a feeling of doing useful work, and the figure is 34% for female workers. There's a clear age gradient in meaningfulness of work. Young workers generally perceive their work less meaningful than older workers. if you look at the youngest group, 20 to 34, only 14% always had the feeling of a job well done. And the figure is 10 percentage points higher among older workers aged 55 to 65. And the pattern is similar for the other two indicators. So these results echo with the quiet quitting phenomenon, which was widely publicized after the pandemic. Younger workers sometimes openly admit on social media that they stopped heading at work, and our data suggests younger workers find it more difficult to find meaning in it. This figure shows meaningful work index by occupational group. In order to provide a comprehensive perspective that captures all individual components of meaningfulness, we took the average score across the three items to create a summative index. Here we can see there are clear variations in meaningful work between occupational groups. The highest meaningful work scores are reported by employees in caring and leisure occupations. They are followed by those in skilled trades. Professionals, administrative and managerial jobs occupy intermediate positions, and the lowest meaningful work scores are reported by elementary workers, machine operatives, and sales and customer service workers. Here we are looking at meaningful work index by industry. You can see the highest level of meaningful work are reported by employees in human health and social work and education. They are followed at some distance by construction. Professional, admin, real estate, and ICT occupy intermediate positions. Lowest levels of meaningful work are found in accommodation and food, and transportation and storage. Meaningfulness is also relatively low in financial and insurance and wholesale and retail. These industry categories are quite highly aggregated. They cover many different types of work. I wanted to get a more detailed picture of where meaningful work is most concentrated. So I also look at a more differentiated occupational classification captured by two-digit industry codes. The sample sizes at this detailed level is much smaller. So I only took the industry categories with at least 50 respondents to get reliable estimate. So when I did this exercise, I found the most meaningful work were reported by residential care workers and social workers. And the least meaningful jobs were reported in warehouse and manufacturers. It seems that meaningful work often involves helping other people or delivering tangible benefits to others. So what job characteristics are associated with perception of meaningful work? Our initial impression from industry and occupational analysis suggests pay doesn't seem to play a dominant role. Here we would like to get further insights. We are looking at a range of key aspects of job quality. Using Employment Survey collected rich information on job quality. It covers not only extrinsic job quality, such as pay and job insecurity, but also intrinsic job quality, like skills, job autonomy, task variety, and so on. Here we are looking at the proportion of people said they always had the feeling of doing useful work or meaningful work by each aspect of job quality. So the job quality variables are broken down into three levels: low, medium, and high, with each level containing similar proportion of workers. And the final column of the table shows correlation between job quality index and overall meaningful work index. This table shows the predominant importance of intrinsic job quality for shaping the meaningfulness of work. If we take managerial support, for example, among employees who have high level of managerial support, 29% said they always had a feeling of a job well done. And the figure is only 8% for people who have low managerial support. And the contrast is also striking for sense of belonging. Among people who have low managerial support, only 10% said their job gives them a sense of belonging. And the figure is 4 times higher, 41%, among people who have strong managerial support. Having opportunity to use skill at work is another critical factor. If we move down to skill utilization, you can see when employees have low level of opportunity to use their skills at work, only 6% always had a feeling of job well done. And the figure is 27% for those who have high opportunity to use their skills. So this is more than 4 times higher. And if you look at doing useful work, the contrast between low and high skill use opportunities is 16% and 42%. These are very large differences. It's also quite interesting to see the feeling of doing useful work does not only depend on the objective nature of the work, but also on depending on whether people feel they are able to contribute to work by applying their skills and abilities. So task variety, organizational participation, and task discretion all emerge as significant determinants of meaningful work. The correlations between intrinsic job quality indicators and meaningful work index falls in the range of 0.3 to 0.5. If we look further down the list, work intensity has a positive correlation with meaningful work. For people who work at higher level of intensity are more likely to find their work meaningful. The effect size is quite small. Job insecurity is linked to lower level of meaningfulness, as you would expect. For people who said they are likely to lose their job in the next 12 months, only 11% had a feeling of a job well done. And the figure is 20% for people who feel secure in their positions. But the size of the effect is modest compared to intrinsic job quality. Finally, if you look at pay, it hardly makes any difference. Among the lowest paid third of respondents, 22% said they always had a feeling of job well done, and the figure is only 14% for the highest paid employees. And very similar pattern is doing useful work. Among low paid workers, 34% always had a feeling of doing useful work, and this is 28% for highly paid workers. The correlation between pay and meaningful work index is close to 0. So this study finds most workers in the UK perceive their work as meaningful. The so-called bullshit jobs are uncommon. Only about 5% of UK workers felt the value of their work. However, young workers are more likely to question the value of their work than older workers. They reported lower level of achievement, perceived usefulness, or sense of belonging. Our analysis of the antecedents of meaningful work highlights the critical importance of intrinsic job quality. Employees who are able to use their skills, take initiative, and count on supportive managers are much more likely to find their work meaningful than those who work in less intrinsically rewarding positions. Interestingly, pay doesn't make much difference. We also found meaningful work is concentrated in healthcare, social work, education, and skilled trade, sectors that typically focus on improving other people's welfare. Our findings suggest if we like to promote meaningful work, we need policies to focus on intrinsic job quality, particularly policies focused on developing skills, participation, and social support. From a social justification perspective, meaningfulness of work depends not only on job quality and its implications for self-realization, but also on the extent to which it contributes to the common good. It's worth noting that the most meaningful jobs reviewed by this study are the same jobs that suffer most from physical violence, sexual harassment, and bullying. If you recall Francis' talk at the beginning, abuse is particularly high among nurses and teachers. The nature of this job is to help other people, which makes them particularly meaningful despite relatively low financial compensation. It's also the people facing the nature of their job that makes them more vulnerable to abuse. So we need policies to protect these workers. We cannot let people who find meaning from helping other people suffer most from abuse. That is not right. And now we are entering a new stage of work. The rapid spread of artificial intelligence technologies has raised new questions about the meaning of work in the future. Technologies are unlikely to directly affect the meaningfulness of work, but it can certainly affect conditions for meaningful work via the mechanisms we have discussed, self-realization and social justification. From a realization perspective, The impact of new technologies on the meaningfulness work will probably mainly depend on how they affect intrinsic job quality. So we need research to monitor how technologies affect skills, participation, and social support. And from a social justification perspective, the impact of technologies will depend on whether they are used to improve societal welfare. Artificial intelligence technologies are highly versatile tools. They can be used for both beneficial and harmful purposes. They can drive scientific breakthroughs, extend life expectancy, and deliver personalized education. But they can also spread misinformation, enable mass surveillance, and create weapons of mass destruction. So the social impact of the jobs created by technologies will play a critical role in shaping their intrinsic value. Our final conclusion is work is most meaningful when it benefits both the self and the others. We need policies to improve intrinsic job quality, and we need policies to safeguard jobs in sectors that directly contribute to public health and well-being. Thanks.
Thank you so much to that absolutely fantastic panel of speakers we've had. That was so rich and interesting for all of us. And thank you to Ying for tying it all together at the end so neatly. I really appreciate that. Thank you also for being on time. We've now got about half an hour, 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So I'm just going to take questions from the room. Please, could you say who you are? If you want to direct your question to a particular speaker, please do that, or otherwise I will do it for you. And I will take, I think I'll take 3 at a time, basically. So do we have, oh, I think we don't need mics because the room is already microphone. So
thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Marketa Gomez. I'm working at the University of Henseke. I found the presentation of Professor Zhou fascinating. And the picture that we have is that people who have the most meaningful jobs or who believe that they do something good for society, that they contribute, they are also, and it's not coincidence, people who are badly paid. So don't you think that there's a darker side related to the meaning of work? Because, okay, it is positive. It is good for our well-being to believe that we have a meaningful job. It is good for the organizations, but the organizations also exploit very much our feelings of doing good and doing something meaningful. And this is why the teachers and the nurses and the care workers are so badly paid. So my thesis is that those of us who are the most convinced that we are doing meaningful job are the most exploited ones.
thank you. We're going to take 3 questions, and then I'll come back to the panel. So I've got 2 on this row, so why don't I take these 2 on this row, the green top and then the hat.
Hi, thanks. I'm Magdalena from the Institute for the Future of Work. Thanks for all the presentations. I also have a question for Ying about meaningful work. I'm always struck by the high figure of meaningful work among the construction workers in the construction sector. And we had similar results when we measured at capabilities outcomes in our own work. But we've never been satisfied with an explanation to that. So is it related to higher task variety that you saw in that? Certainly, I don't think it's led by higher managerial support, doesn't look like. Is it just that it's more related to manual work and before you can see more immediate results of your work, so less animated? Do you have any theories about what's behind that high meaningful work?
Great.
Alex Wood from Cambridge University. My question is about task discretion. I was wondering just whether do you look at high task discretion, whether people who responded with a fair amount of task discretion, whether that's also going in the same trend and what the levels are, because that also, still saying you have a fair amount of discretion still seems quite positive. But also, have you started to look at what's associated with this decline in discretion, and particularly around technology? And I'm interested to see that you have new questions on technology. Because it would seem from a lot of qualitative increasingly direct and script people in their work, as well as increasing survey workers. So I'm very interested to know if you've looked at the correlates of that.
Right, so we've got a couple of questions for Ying, and I'm going to come to Duncan on class discretion, and then Francis and Rhys awarding, but I will also answer your questions.
The first question, I completely agree with you that pursuit meaningful work carries a risk. When people want their work meaningful, might be realistic to work and work harder. That's why it's really important for policy to protect these workers. It should ensure healthy working conditions, for example, ensure reasonable workload, high environment. Meaningful work should not be pursued at the cost of employee well-being. And for the question about construction workers, I also thought hard about that. I don't think it's the manual nature of their work, because you wouldn't be able to explain why warehouse workers got their work not meaningful. It's also manual. When I look at the 2 digits of the industry code, it's a specialist construction workers that found their work most meaningful. So there is a skill element. But apart from the skill element, I think it's being able to see the impact of your work. That's very satisfying. It's like nurses, doctors, and teachers. You directly see how your work benefits other people. That makes a huge difference.
Thanks. Duncan, do you want to pick up the questions about task discretion?
Well, the fair amount changes very little. I mean, the increases in not much and none. So, I mean, you get different figures, lots of additive. And the decline is a little less. But it's, in my mind, when you look at how these things relate to well-being and motivation, it is those who have significant influence over their task who really benefit. So the question is how far that's down that scale we choose to go in terms of really getting information that's important for the major facility themselves. Well, on the technology one, well, of course, there's a huge history about technology and workers' autonomy on the job, and a lot of that came at the end of the Second World War and right through the 50s and 60s and 70s. You have a massive literature on that. On the whole, of course, that literature was very pessimistic, but I think the conclusion that finally came out was that pessimistic picture was partly due to selective case study work. The people sort of focused on things like the car industry, the assembly line. You weren't getting a true picture of how most workers were, really experiencing their work across small companies and across different parts of the country, and of course under very different trade union conditions and so on. The other thing which came out of the sort of early waves research on automation was the conclusion that technology per se is not critical. So you could take, for instance, highly automated plants in different countries. I mean, belonging to the same company and really very similar in every way. But actually the way they were run and the amount of autonomy people had was very different. So, to say that technology is going to have this effect or that effect in the future is extremely difficult because so much depends on managerial decisions about how to organize the work. And management has a lot of discretion on how it's going to do that. Which is why, I think what we need to do is to understand management, the sort of thinking behind the key decisions they're making, which have tremendous consequences for the well-being of employees and don't seem to make any sense in terms of the economic efficiency of their organizations.
I might come back to that question.
Could I just add one point, another argument against technology, but building on the other countries, the aggregate studies, they may not use exactly the same data, but I mean, using ANUS's data across Europe, it's by far from a universal trend, this downward. There are many countries where there seems to be indications of increasing participation, maybe slightly different measures, but if it was just pure technology in some kind of neutral way, you'd expect to see that in lots of different countries, and pretty well everywhere.
So I just wanted to ask you another question about that link that Ying drew at the end between kind of high meaning jobs and jobs which face the most abuse. Do you think that's a kind of not random correlation, but it's because they're public facing, or do you think people put up with more abuse because they're in jobs where they find meaning?
The economist in me says compensating differential. Certainly, if there were economists in the room, that's what they would say. But I think there's all sorts of factors which determine low pay in the public sector. So it's an interesting correlation at the moment. I don't think we've really got to grips as to exactly why it is, but it is a kind of compensating thing, I suppose. I imagine many nurses might say, I'm getting deep satisfaction from this job, and they kind of develop resilience against certain incidents that they have to deal with in their daily lives.
Thanks. And then Rhys, this is maybe a question for me, not you, but if you were looking across these findings, you've looked at that unmet demand for unionisation, where would you see kind of the organising opportunities? Which of these findings do you think, well, if unions talk more about that, they might be meeting some of that unmet need for unionisation? Does your data tell you that, or have you got views?
I think probably the data is saying that I think the assets that unions have available to them have to be taken very broadly. It's obviously got the physical assets, HQ buildings, but also opinions and attitudes towards trade unions also form part of the potential assets that are available towards the trade union movement. So the more favourable attitudes that exist to trade unions in the once industrialised parts of the UK, the more favourable attitudes that exist to trade unions amongst those with, for example, with protected characteristics or who are at fear of perhaps of risk of discrimination and victimisation in the labour market. And the trade union movement could, tap into those positive attitudes and perhaps extend its organising beyond a traditional workplace-based approach to reach out to particular groups of workers, irrespective of where they're employed, who have certain positive feelings and attitudes towards trade union movement. So there's certainly room for maneuver there.
And we've got time for some more rounds of questions. We'll go from the front end and then take the four people who just had their hands up, and I'll come back in the next round. Okay.
My name is Shreyashi Chakravarti. I'm from University of Greenwich. Thanks a lot for the provoking conversations and the findings. So my first question is for Professor Green, that the questionnaire mentioned about cyberbullying, but those results were not separately reported. So was this a conscious decision that cyberbullying would be integrated into the other aspects of bullying together? Or was it some other, probably because you mentioned if there are not too many cases or the cell size is removed less, it would not be considered in that sense. So that is one question. And for Professor Zhou, this keeps me intriguing that why do managers feel that their work is not that meaningful when compared to the other professions like teachers or nurses for that matter? Why are they tend to be on the intermediate level when they hypothetically their job should be more meaningful because they have more autonomy, they have more decision-making power. So why does possibly some thought of that? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think I have three rows back. Yep.
Hello, Ashley from Kingston University. The question for Professor Green, when you look at workplace abuse, did you have a look also at variation across industries? I'm thinking of the creative industry where cases of abuse have been particularly represented on the media. And for Professor Ying, just a link between AI and this meaningful work. In one of your graphs, I can see that the occupation with the least meaning, sales and customer services and localities. And I think these are occupations that are already being replaced by AI, the online sale or supermarkets don't have customer detail anymore. So do you think that perhaps one of the positive effects of AI would be to replace occupations that don't have much need?
Great, thank you. I'm going to put that to the whole panel, so everyone. I think have one here and then.
Yeah, Rob Golo, question for Duncan. You left us on a bit of a cliffhanger you showed the target participation rates and then said why and what's done about it. Your last comment said it makes no sense. If you don't mind, you can make more sense. Why and what can be done about it?
Right, and then just there for the show.
Yeah, Malik Batka. I just wonder if the panel, thank you very much for some brilliant presentations, by the way, which interleaved very neatly, I thought. I wonder if you think that there's a higher issue that affects everything that you've been discussing, and that is the dissonance and indeed incompatibility of two systems of governance that we have. On the one hand, we have democracy, which is one person, one vote. And in the corporate world, and that reflects in the public sector, we have a position of £1, one vote. And therefore, managers are managing the money, they're not managing the people. That permeates the entire structure within which they work. And therefore, when you go out and vote, you think you're voting for a new government. But if you're a worker, you have no agency except that which management gives you. So if you look at Japan with the Ring-Sato system, there is a much more iterative approach, but that's a cultural matter which doesn't translate to a UK company or a US company. To what extent do you think actually, if you had a situation where workers were able, employees were able to vote at the annual general meeting instead of shareholders, that would transform the relationship between management and workforce and would be a much better reflection of the business acting as a whole?
Right, so I'm going to go along the panel, taking up, we've got cyberbullying. Why is middle management so rubbish? Are we going to automate bullshit jobs out of existence? Why don't companies adopt more productive working models? And would different systems of corporate governance be more democratic and produce a more alignment between corporate and individual goals? So any or all of those, starting with you.
I'll take the easy ones first. Cyberbullying is the full question. It was a much lower frequency of people suffering from cyberbullying. It's interesting, but for ease of analysis and presentation, we decided to lump it in with other kinds of bullying. But it would certainly be possible to look at the prevalence of cyberbullying. I suspect that the interest in that question will increase in 5 years' time, or whenever we do the next survey, to see whether that's spreading. And the creative industries, I didn't look at that. That's a really good question, and I would certainly have a look at that question. I mean, creative industries needs defining, of course. Sure, you know, there's lots of different ways of doing it. I can't go down too far. We can't go down too far in the disaggregation, but it may well be possible to have a look at that specific question at a future date, when the data will be publicly available, of course. Eventually.
What can one do about it? In the last days of the previous Labour government, I found myself at a small meeting in Downing Street discussing this issue, chaired by a person called Ed Miliband. And when we put this question to him, he turned to the sole member of the business school who happened to be at the meeting, and he said, "It's your fault. You're training them badly." So I think there is something in this business of low levels of training of management in how you run people, companies. And we know that there are differences in terms of the education intake compared to a country like France and so on, training. But I think it is this very basic sort of training which is at fault. Now, I think the argument that, that if you're looking for ways forward, that changing systems of corporate governance is a very strong one. And it does seem to me that managers, partly because they're so busy, partly because of the way they're trained, are not going to listen unless they get, contested in a very direct way by people with some sort of leverage. And the way you're mentioning seems to me a very sensible way forward.
I think actually that's a point that also address your question about managers. And if you look at the intermediate jobs, it's not only managers but also professionals like ICT real estate. What the most meaningful jobs have in common is to directly see the impact of your work. If a nurse, if a teacher, to see how you benefit other people directly. and probably professional managers a bit more removed from the frontline. If you think about during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of key workers on the frontline, like delivery drivers, nurses, and the people who give COVID vaccines often find their work quite meaningful. So it's not so much how much you earn, it's what you do that shape the meaningfulness of the work. And for the question about AI, my hope would be very much like that. In the future, AI can automate the tedious job tasks and free up individuals for more meaningful, more engaging work that provides a sense of fulfillment. That is very nice future. We'd like to see that. And if you look at what happened in the past, actually my research co-authored with Mark Williams, who's sitting somewhere in the audience, we found if you look at 1986 to 2017, basically history employment survey, it is the lower quality jobs that have been gradually replaced by technologies. But that was not AI. AI is much more recent. So that can see a continuation of that.
Just on giving employees the vote, I think many of the problems that we face today are companies that don't have any owners. Companies in the good old days used to be owned by big families, long heritage, history, and the decisions that they would take, but obviously they would their success would they would live or die with them. So I think the problem of ownerless companies is clearly an issue, rather than necessarily getting employees the vote.
Thanks, Ruth. I think we've got time and maybe appetite in the room for one more round of questions. I have Brendan, then I've got two more back there and one back there.
Yeah, Brendan Birchall from the University of Cambridge. And this really, Francis, question for you. Really, I mean, I thought, first of all the presentations and all the analysis that went into them were really, really fantastic. Thank you very much. The looking at the abuse, and certainly your headline figure really shows how important this is, and something maybe needs a lot more attention. When it comes to the breakdowns you're doing, though, I'm never sure, using survey methodology, the extent to which we're genuinely picking up different levels of abuse or bullying and so on, or in different situations, the threshold that people put between appropriate, robust criticism or assertive management and bullying. And that line will vary, I think, a lot. In some workplaces, shouting at each other wouldn't be considered that unusual. In other situations, that would immediately be seen as being very threatening and bullying. And I think, and when you look at the European Working Conditions Survey and look at the international differences, this is even more so apparent that you get, for instance, much higher levels of abuse and so on in Scandinavian countries than you do in Mediterranean countries. And I assume that's again to do with that threshold difference. Is there anything we can do about that? Or is, and the final question, why are you only asking about the people who are the recipients of this bullying? Why don't you ask people if they're perpetrators?
Thank you. We'll take the other question, and then we can come back to that. So I think two people can green on this road in whichever order.
Irene from University of Leeds, really enjoyed it. Absolutely fantastic presentations. Really looking forward to publications. On discretion, you reported here today the results in 2017, but there was a massive decline in discretion from 1986 to 2002. Then it stabilises. It's on the way down again. It strikes me that people working in 2024 surely have a vastly different experience of work that we are not seeing, perhaps because we're too close to it, than they did in 1986. And the abuse and meaningful work, I'm minded that in the job satisfaction data, there's always a dilemma over sex, because women will report that they have great jobs that they really enjoy when those jobs are objectively not very good. And I'm wondering how the abuse and the meaningfulness disaggregates by sex. Do we again have women saying, despite abuse, this is a great and meaningful job, and men would not say that?
Right, thank you. And then next to you. Thank you. My name is Carrie. I collect people. My question, and I hope it's borne out, I think, by the questions and the speakers who said who they are already, is where are the employers in the room? How do we get them involved, listening and
Right. We've got one there, and I can take one more there, and then that'll be it.
Yes, Josh Miles from Learning and Work Institute. I'm going to give you an opportunity to finish for the band here. Perhaps you a little bit on policy. So we've got the Employment Rights Bill progressing at the moment. In particular, there's a focus in there on adult social care in England, which I think is quite germane to the data you've presented today. Do you think the turn in government policy around this area is sufficient? And if not, what else needs to happen to improve some of the trends we've seen here?
Very quickly to say.
Thank you very much, Joshua Bugler, Welsh Government. What does the Skills and Employment Survey tell us about disabled workers? And are there particular industries in which trade union density and coverage is particularly increasing or decreasing beyond that flat lining?
Right, so loads of questions there. You've got about a minute to answer each. So I'm going to shut up and just go along the panel, and maybe we'll go in the other order.
Union density. You cannot beat the nuclear sector trying to improve trade union membership in your locality. There's a little pet project of mine. Copeland, which is where the Sellafield nuclear processing facility is by far the highest level of trade union membership of any place in the UK. So the expansion of nuclear power across different parts of the UK attached to each city, that's probably a very good shot in the arm for trade union.
To answer the question of gender gap in job satisfaction, you are absolutely right. There's a paradox. Women always report higher job satisfaction than men, despite their lower pay and inferior working conditions. But sometimes this has been attributed to work values, orientations, preferences, and so on. There's an encouraging development. Later research has found this gender gap in job satisfaction has almost disappeared. For women's preferences are changing as they get higher level of education and better quality jobs. They expect more from their work. So we wonder whether the same will happen with meaningful work also.
On the employer issue, yes, it really would be good to have the employers more involved, because they're already so busy that they don't listen to their workforce. It's going to be very tricky. But I have actually had a discussion with some employers in the last survey, and they do come up with interesting ideas. So it would be nice. I remember one meeting, the stress was on changes in accountability. In a sense, employers are getting more worried about allowing employees to take decisions because of accountability issues, that they have to report upwards, and they always have to report when the figures are getting better. So they really need to make sure they're in control. And I think these sorts of arguments would be much more interesting if we had some employers around to discuss them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do I get the last say? Fantastic. Yeah, the perception of abuse is really paramount. I did say that earlier, and I do believe that, but only up to a point. I mean, I think I'm very distrustful of, narrow differences between countries, and that could it be perception? The Me Too movement comes along. Could that be affecting perceptions of sexual harassment and so on and so forth? So I basically totally agree with you. I remember sitting on a panel once as a governor of a school, and not a teacher of a non-teaching staff was being accused of misbehaviour and so on and so forth. He called it bullying. The school was calling it misbehaviour. So it was difficult, but there was an objective truth there. It was our job to try and find out what it was. But yeah, I agree, and we had to be very careful about looking at the data. Second thing I would like to say about this abuse and satisfaction thing. Please bear in mind these are kind of initial reports. We haven't fully looked at it, and one of the things we should like to look at, Ying and I have been working a little bit separately on this. Are the same people reporting abuse also reporting meaningful work? Seems to me the next thing we should be looking at to try and get a handle on this question. My bet is they're not, and that there's a kind of polarization going on. But finally, on this employer issue is really, really important, and I would like to just signal some research that I've been doing with John. Is John here? John Paul here? John sitting at the back, who's been kindly sitting as one of our advisors on this whole survey. But John and I have been working on the old-fashioned WERS survey, trying to look at the role of employers in determining how job quality varies. And we're finding that an enormous effect. And then it really basically is, in short, confirming what we've been saying, that employers, who you work for, can make a big difference. And in a way, that's not surprising. In a way, also, it's kind of good news that we can do something about that, hopefully. We don't need to wait for 10 years of economic growth to improve things. If we can change the way that employers behave, if we can improve employer training and so on and so forth. So, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Francis. That's a great positive note to end on. We're just going to finish first for the fifth mention of the 19th of May, a day for all of your diaries. Should be another really fantastic event. I want to say a massive thank you to all our speakers, to the panel just now, to all of the sponsors, of course, and then a massive thank you to the Wizard team who've made this all work. So Kirsten, Brandon, Chloe, Lelia, and of course Alan himself. So big thanks to everybody. And